Perennials of the academic calendar is the spate of complaints you hear around this time of year when parents realise their children haven't been given their first choice of school place. The national average for getting your first preference around the country was 83% this year. That masks quite a range in our region. It was 43% in Slough, just over 80% in Brighton. It doesn't much matter what percentage of pupils got their first choice if it's your child who didn't. So just how do you make the system fair and help as many people as possible get to the school that they want to go to? I'm joined by Bob Howitt from Action for Kids, who's a Brighton parent with concerns about how they handle the admissions over there. Margaret Morrissey, the founder of ParentsOutloud, who's been getting feedback from parents all over the country. And in our Reading studio, John Hartley, who's the lead counsellor for education and lifelong learning on Reading Borough Council. Let's start with you and Brighton, Bob, first of all. You're worried things really are getting worse at the moment, despite all the stuff we've heard about lotteries, ballots.
Well, again, Brighton Hove was the first council to adopt the lottery system, and since adopting the lottery system, in essence, you can see the fairness of it, but in reality, as you say, 80% of parents...
But that's good compared to some places.
It's good some places, but West Sussex got 94%. A much higher figure. They're not in the lottery system. And also we have to remember 20% is hundreds of people. We're not talking a handful of people. A lot of families and a lot of children affected. And
people moving to Brighton and the increased birth rate means it is going to get worse.
Yeah, because Brighton and Hove is destined to grow by 20%. They have a requirement to build 11,000 new homes. And Brighton is the economic hub of the South East. And obviously the inward migration is going to continue to grow. So we need to effectively deal with the infrastructure, which is providing schools.
Margaret Morrissey, I mean, in the budget next week, we're almost certainly going to see education protected compared to other places. You know, an increase in money. Are you hearing that from parents, that there are places available?
No, I'm not hearing it. And I think, you know, we talk about all the money that government give. We've talked about it. I've been in this business for 25 years as a parent activist. Nothing has changed. Very little has improved. Money is given. I can almost guarantee money will be taken back.
Fortune had loads more money.
They have loads more money, but unfortunately, the programme isn't put into the capital building scheme for councils. So they don't get on with the building, and at the end of the year, the money's clawed back and it's not used. Very few are actually built. We've been waiting in my area for a primary school for 3 years.
Isn't it often down to parents, for example, in small village schools where there aren't so many children around, maybe they're teaching 10 in a class or something like that, and they object to the closure of the school. The money's not moving around the system properly.
No, absolutely not. I would support every school staying open, and this is one of the problems.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it?
Well,
you've got changing situations
and
parents are stopping it happening.
We don't want to detract from our education service. We want our small children to stay within their community, to go to school where they are safe and protected. We want government to say, when we do buildings and putting in large amounts of social housing into an area, prior to that housing being built, we'll build schools. We should not be saying to parents, because the government have said to us as a local council, and I don't blame councils, we have got to fill all the places in our schools, otherwise you won't get any funding for a new school, regardless of where those are. So we have 4-year-olds going 10 miles to school. Absolutely ridiculous. Right. And I think the whole system, as has been said on the national programme by Nick Clegg, is rotten to the core. It needs tipping out and we need to start again.
Right, John Hartley, you're a Labour councillor there in Reading, the lead on education. Can we keep increasing places in schools, in the most popular schools, or are you in a bit of a balancing act here with the parents?
Well, I think it's always got to be a balancing act, Peter, because if we, for instance, increased by 10% in all the popular schools, we'd either have to reduce the size of the less popular schools or close them, and of course the popularity of schools with parents changes quite radically over relatively short periods of time, certainly the planning of major capital projects like 4 or 5 years.
And so, for example, in Reading as well, with the recession, there are things that come along that you don't foresee, like people not moving out of smaller houses, and so you're needing to provide school places in different areas?
Well, that's true, and of course it changes the population characteristics. Like Brighton, Reading's an area with a lot of high demand, but if people aren't in a position anymore, say, to move up to a larger house or apartment as their family grows, it means they'll actually be in a different place in the town when, say, they come to choosing secondary schooling for their children.
But and what about this money from the government with building schools? Are you getting enough to do what you want to do?
Well, Reading's in the queue for building schools for the future. We're hoping to have some money to spend next year. It's why I'm so keen to see a Labour government re-elected, because of course the Conservatives would scrap the scheme, the same as they cut back on investment during their last period of government.
But wait a minute, even this Labour government isn't providing money to Brighton, is it, Bob? I mean,
well,
you're just hoping that the money will come and being told, well, it might not have arrived.
Well, again, we realise there's going to be cutbacks, but I know that we have an imbalance in Brighton Hove because we have a large pot for secondary. Primary is actually a very small pot and not sufficient to build schools. So we suffer from that point of view. But one thing I want to bring back to is that when we look about opening schools, I think we have to remember that in Brighton, 95% of primary school places, we're at busting point. We're at the legal maximum. And it's a shame that councils don't look in the future when they're building schools to actually reduce that, so we can actually look at 25 to a class rather than continuing at this 30 and 30 plus.
Margaret, we've talked about, parents who want their first choice. Surely we should be worrying about the ones whose parents aren't pushing, the children from more disadvantaged backgrounds who are not being supported properly through this education system and not getting the results, rather than the ones who've got parents who'll fight on their behalf.
Well, I think we have to go back to John Patton, who started all this nonsense of choice and first choice and second choice and parent choices. In the Parents' Charter, he actually said parents could make a choice, but then he retracted on that and said state of preference. And it's been continued by politicians. I think the thing that annoys me...
That's because parents want choice, or some parents want choice.
Well, they do want choice, but it's got to be realistic. I mean, it's quite insulting to say, please fill in a form and say which 3 schools you want, and knowing full well that at the end of the day, you'll get the schools that they want you to have. It really has got to stop. Government have done a very good thing in the last 10 years, and I would applaud them for it. They have raised the expectations of parents. They have raised the involvement of parents. Very sadly, what they have yet to do, and what the next government has got to do, is to give parents the actual ability to use those expectations and to use their input. Right. And at the moment we can't. And what I want to see from this election is all councillors and all politicians to stop playing politics with our schools, stop saying what you want to say to get us your vote, and actually think what is going to be best for the children in this area. Because certainly in the town I live in Dorchester, which is Conservative controlled, we don't get a fair whack of money from government.
True, there's problems in the south of England. John, wrap us up here then. What would you like to see done better, apart from, as you put earlier, getting yourself a Labour government? I mean, from any government that comes in, what could be done better for Reading Borough Council? Well, most of the parents that I talk to want a good local school. So I think local authorities, the government, the schools themselves should all be concentrating on seeing each of our local area schools, whether they be primary or secondary, improving their quality. If we can do that, it means that parents actually will have a range of choices, because it won't be a few schools in an area that parents are choosing between. So I think that's got to be the first priority. What do you say to that?
We've been doing that for the last 10 years, and we will not ever have every school the same. Well, it's not a possibility.
And I think, what is the definition of local when you've got children travelling miles away from their community?
Well, in Reading we've been able to increase the quality of schools' achievement in the local area, and that makes a big difference to the parents.
Okay.
Well done, you.
John, thank you very much. Margaret and Bob as well.